Hey everyone, my name is Carlos. I'm a web developer based in Brooklyn, New York, and today we're going to recreate a painting using Bootstrap Grid. Hey guys, before we get started on the project, I'd like to go a little bit over the column grid for Bootstrap. Now, Bootstrap's latest version, which is Bootstrap 4, that uses Flexbox, which makes it very dynamic and fully responsive. The grid system itself is made up of a series of containers, rows, and columns to lay out and align the content. Now the grid is made up of 12 responsive columns, and you can think of this as a table with 12 columns with however rows we want inside of them. So we can have a banner, for example, that uses up 12 columns like we have here at the top row. We can also have two divs, each div using up 6 columns like we have in the second row, and we can even manually set how many columns we want each div to take up on. So if we look on the fourth row here, we have one column that takes up 8 columns, and then another div that takes up 4 columns. Now the grid columns are created by specifying the number of 12 available columns you wish to span. So for example, if we have 4 different column divs inside one row, each column would take up 3 space columns because 3 times 4 equals 12. And the same would apply to a row containing 6 div columns, for example. So each one would take up 2 column spaces because 6 times 2 equals 12, and the same would be up to 12 individual columns. Now, due to Bootstrap's dynamic usage of Flexbox, the grid system itself is fully responsive, meaning that web pages will adapt their layouts to user screen's widths. So using predefined classes that Bootstrap provides for these columns, we can set breakpoints in the columns so that they can expand or shrink size depending on the width of the screen. So with this, we can actually create quite nested and complex layouts. So let's look at a diagram that can help us understand how we can actually accomplish this. So in this example, we have 3 different types of layouts that might look a little familiar to you. Anything in here that's represented by a yellow border is a container. Anything that has a red border represents a row, and anything that has a blue border represents a column. Now, if we look at the basic layout, we have our yellow bordering that represents a container here. Inside that container, we have one row, and inside that one row, we have one column. So the column itself would take up the whole 12 spaces since there's no more other columns or rows taking up more space. In a more nested layout, we have to work a little differently with the rows and columns. So inside our main container, we have one row itself, and inside that row, we have a column as well. Now, one important rule is that columns cannot be nested inside columns. They actually have to be nested inside rows, or they have to be children of rows. So the column is needed there because inside that column we're going to put in 3 different rows, and each row will have a different amount of columns themselves. So you can have the main column that will inside of there have 3 different rows. So you can see the rows here, one row, the second row, and the third row. And each row can have as many columns as well. You can see in the third row we have 3 different columns, and each column itself would take up 4 spaces each, 4 space columns, since they're all evenly spread out inside that row. Now, in a more complex layout, you can see right over here on the entire page layout, we're still going to be using the same concept of how the columns and rows work. Now, you can see here, despite it being quite nested, it's still working the same way. We have our main container here, which is the outer yellow border, and inside that border, we have 2 main rows. So we have this one at the top, which is basically the nav bar, you can think of it like that. And the bottom row here represents basically the whole container for the information about the profile of the user we're looking at. And each of those rows can have a certain amount of columns, and within those columns you can have even more rows. So if it makes it easier to understand, you can think of this as creating mini grids within grids. So within this bottom row that we have in there, we have 3 different columns. So you can see here we have one column, we have the second column here, and we have a third column. And within each of those columns, we have more rows. Now, the reason we have rows is because you can't just set columns within columns. They have to be nested within rows as well. So we have one row here that represents maybe the picture of the profile of the user. Then we have another row here that has one column, which has taken up the whole space of that row. And then we have one last row here, similar to the one we have from the nested layout example. And that row has 3 columns, each taking up the same amount of space. Inside our second column here, we have 3 different rows, and maybe you can think of this as some sort of status update part or section of the profile, and that one column has 3 different rows, which each have 2 columns. So you can see that they're still like grids within grids. They're working the same way. And you can see here the last example as well. We have one column with 4 rows, and each row has a certain amount of columns. So the top row only has 1 column, which takes up the whole space of the row, and the bottom rows have 2 columns, and they're both spread out evenly. So now that you have a better understanding on how the layout works, let's go ahead and get started with the project. So for this project, we're actually going to be using Bootstrap Grid to recreate a painting called Composition 2 in Red, Blue, and Yellow by Piet Mondrian. Now for the project itself, we're actually already provided with a styling sheet, so we're not going to be worrying too much about the background color, the heights, the widths, or borders. We're mostly going to be focusing on the layout and using rows and columns to recreate the painting itself. So if you scroll a little bit further down, you'll see a very helpful diagram here that basically splits up the blocks and labels them. You'll see in your index HTML as well that they're basically a div each, and they have an ID. So with this ID, we can actually style them with all the proper borders, border widths, and background colors. So we're going to be using these divs to actually figure out how we're going to place them with rows and columns. Now, there are no step-by-step instructions for this project, so you're going to have to actually experiment a bit and mess around with the divs and rows and columns, but there are some hints out right here below. So the first thing here for the first task is to actually think about the ordering. Right now at the moment, we're all basically having the divs stacked vertically on top of each other, since each column is taking up all the spaces. So you can see here on your right on the browser how each block here is basically taking up a whole column itself. So we got to figure out how we're actually going to order these columns. So let's go back to the diagram here and see where is some sort of divisor that splits up the whole painting. I personally see one divider here that splits up the top section, which has the blocks A, B, and C, and the bottom section has D, E, F, and G. So the top section in itself, that looks like a row to me. This one bottom here at the bottom is also another row, and each of those rows has other rows and columns. So it's easier to if we break this down and work on one section first. So for starters, I'm going to break down the top section here, which is one row, and we're going to organize the A, B, and C blocks. So first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to move the A div here all the way at the top, make some spacing here. I'm going to grab the B as well, move it right under the A block, correct my indentation here, and we'll also move the C div here. So like I said, these 3 divs here are contained within one row, I'm sorry. So I'm going to actually expand this, and so we have a little easier way to see actually what we're coding. And I'm going to put all these 3 blocks here within one row, because like I said, these 3 blocks are contained within the top row. So let's make a div here with a class called row. Make sure you close the div as well. And let's indent this a little bit more. And just in case you're wondering, I'm simply using Tab on my MacBook for indentation. Okay, so now that we have the one row, we got to figure out how exactly we're going to split up the A and B blocks from the C block, because at the moment they're stacked on top of each other. So we have to split them up, and you can see that the C block is taking about 3/4 of a row, and A and B are taking about 1/4. So we can specify the amount of columns we want C to take, and we can put A and B blocks within its own column, and then from there we can split them in their own separate rows. So let's take a second and think about how we're going to be breaking up this row. We know that the C block is taking about 3/4 of the whole row, and the other column is taking up 1/4 of the row. And we also know that a row is made up of 12 spaced columns. So in order to make the column take up 1/4, we got to make sure that the column itself is made up of 3 spaced columns, since 3 out of 12 will be 1/4 of the row. That will leave us with 9 spaced columns, which we can use all of them up for block C in order to complete the whole row. And you can see how important it is to actually know how you're splitting up the columns and making sure that all the spaced columns add up to 12 in order to avoid any unexpected behavior with your rows and columns. So let's start out by creating a column that takes up 3 spaced columns, which will contain both rows A and B. So right below our first row over here and on top of the A div, let's go ahead and create a div with a class that takes up 3 column spaces. We're going to close it up right before the C div, and I'm going to indent this as well. So we'll go ahead and save and then refresh and open our browser here. You'll basically see the structure of the top row coming together. You'll see that we have here the A block and the B block, which are basically the columns taking up 3 spaces. And the second column here, we haven't specified. It automatically takes up the rest of the columns, but we're going to actually pass in and specify exactly how many columns we want the C block to take. So I'm going to go ahead and add and specify that it's 9. Go ahead and save. It shouldn't really change because it automatically updates depending on how many columns are left over. It's also worth mentioning that the reason the columns look a little bit weird at the moment, that's because there are columns inside columns. And you can see that since we used up 3 columns for the column A and B, then 9 columns are left over for the other side since it adds up to 12. So let's expand this again. I'll bring out the diagram. Now for this column here, which has A and B, we're actually going to be splitting up A and B into their own separate rows. So let's go ahead and create a row for A. We'll close it up right over here. We'll create one for B as well. And we'll close it up right over here as well. I'm going to fix the indentation as well. Now, just for specificity, let's actually specify how many column spaces we're actually going to be taking up for each row. Now, like I said in the previous diagram, we're actually going to be thinking of creating mini grids within grids. So if we say 12 columns here, we're not talking about 12 columns of the whole diagram itself. We're talking 12 columns of the specific row we're actually working in. So if I say 12 columns for the specific row here, which is the A block, we're taking up all the columns themselves. If we actually were to say 3, we would actually be taking up 1/4 of this row itself. But we want to take up the whole row because one row, the row we're talking about, is this whole block here. So let's go ahead and save that, open up our browser, refresh it again, and you can see now that the block itself is being completed and the border is filled out. So with this, we've actually completed the top row, and now we can move on forward with the bottom section, which has the blocks D, E, F, and G. So let me expand this again. So looking at the diagram again, we have an idea how we're actually going to be structuring the columns and rows. You can see here that we have one column, another column here taken by E, and a third column taken by F and G. The third column on the right is split up with 2 rows, similarly to the A and B block, and each of these columns are taking up different spaces. So we're going to be working with the divs D and E first, so I'm simply just going to grab the divs and put them to the top here. Make sure I fix my indentation as well. Grab the E div as well. Put them right over here. Okay, so once we have that done, we're going to start structuring the columns. But you got to make sure that these columns are contained within one whole row because we have one row here at the top that we already structured, and we need to contain these columns within rows. So 2 important rules here is 1, that columns must be the immediate child of a row, and 2, that rows are used to contain columns and nothing else. So let's go ahead and indent these and put them within their own row. Close off the row here as well. So now we can figure out how many column spans we're going to be taking up for each block. So let's look at D block over here. We can see that it's taken the same span blocks for A and B. And if we look up again, we used 3 columns for that column itself. So let's specify for D, we're simply going to be using 3 columns. So let's save this and open up the browser. Make sure you refresh. And you can see that the bottom row is coming together. You can see that the D block here is taking up the same amount of space as A and B, so we're doing good. Now we got to figure out how we're going to split up the F block, which is right here, and the G block. Since they're just both taking up the same amount of columns, they're stacked horizontally. Now, one thing we can do before we start working on the blocks F and G is that we can specify how many span columns we want block E to take up. If we have D block taking up 3 columns and F and G will take about 1 spanned column, that means we have 8 left over for div E to take up. So we can just specify that div to take up 8 span columns. And what will occur now is that since there's no space for the G block, it will probably move down to the bottom right below it. So let's go ahead and save that and refresh. And you can see that the G block is stacked up vertically on top right below the last row because there's no space for it here. If you pay attention to the amount of columns we have in this row, if you look at D, we have 3, then we have 8, and then these are basically, the column leftovers are basically translated to whatever is available. So this would take up the last column left. However, since there's no space for 13 columns, the G block is basically moved to a whole different row because there's no 13th column in that row. So we have to put in these two columns into one row. That row will take up 1 column. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to expand this again, and we'll start working on the last 2 blocks. So let's go ahead and put these 2 columns inside 1 column, taking up 1 spanned column. Now remember that columns have to be within rows, so we actually have to create 2 rows for that column itself. So let's go ahead and indent this, and I'll create a new column here that will take up 1 spanned column. Oh, I can't seem to type here today. We'll set it to 1 spanned column, and we're going to close it right after our D block. Okay, let's go ahead and save this, and let's go ahead and look again at our diagram, and you can see now that the G is back into where it's supposed to be, right below the F block. So last thing we need to do is essentially create 1 row for each of these divs, and to make sure that they all take up the whole spanned column for that row. So I'm just going to set it up to take up 12 already, and all we need to do is create 1 row for each of these divs. Make sure you close them properly in the right place. I'm going to do the same for the last block. We'll indent this as well. Save that, and let's bring out our final diagram. Now you can see it's looking pretty much exactly like it does in the original painting. Now feel free to experiment with different types of widths for these columns. Bootstrap is very useful in the sense that it uses Flexbox and makes it very responsive, and Bootstrap provides predefined classes. So we can actually set breakpoints for each of these divs to change its width depending on the type of screen we're using. So if we're using mobile phones, we can set up a breakpoint for these divs to change and take up a different amount of space. Similarly, we can do that if we're using tablets and large screens, for example. If you like to give it a shot, there's a few bonus steps at the bottom here that you can actually try out and see if you can mess around with them. Treat this as your playground if you like, but hopefully this gave you a better understanding of how the grid system works with Bootstrap and how to make your page layout a little bit more responsive and dynamic. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you all next time.